Okay, now let's turn to the second major sensory motor reflex that's driven by the vestibular system, and it concerns adjustments of posture. So this is another major function of these nuclei that are found in this vestibular nuclear complex. They produce reflexive adjustments of posture that compensate for movements of the head. So in order to do so, there are descending projections from these vestibular nuclei in the lateral tegmentum of the upper medulla and the caudal pons down into the spinal cord. And they contribute to what we will describe as a medial system of descending axons that regulate posture. So I emphasize medial because we will find these axons in the most medial parts of the white matter of the spinal cord. Now, this will differentiate these systems from the axons that we find in the lateral columns of the spinal cord that are associated with the cortical spinal pathway that are mainly governing what we do with our distal extremities. So the medial spinal cord pathways are concerned with posture. The lateral spinal cord pathways are concerned with what we do with our hands and with our feet, what we might call skilled behavior. Now, this medial and lateral dichotomous arrangement of systems in the spinal cord is going to be much more clear when we get into the motor systems, but there's some peril in introducing that here, because when we identify the connections from the vestibular nuclear complex to the spinal cord, we realize that there are really two tracks that we want to be concerned with. One is called the medial vestibulospinal tract, and these axons run down through the medial part of the white matter of the spinal cord. And the other is called the lateral vestibulospinal tract. Now, it's called lateral because these axons are in a more lateral position in the white matter of the spinal cord, but they're still part of the medial descending system. So I want you to recognize when we get into our unit on motor control that both the medial and the lateral vestibulospinal tract are concerned with postural control, and they will innervate the medial part of the ventral horn of the spinal cord. So we'll come back to that point, but for now, I just want you to know these terms, medial vestibulospinal tract and lateral vestibulospinal tract. So the medial vestibulospinal tract arises from the medial vestibular nucleus, and it gives rise to bilateral projections that innervate mainly motor neurons in the cervical cord that are concerned with the movements of our head and our neck, and perhaps as far down as the segments of the cervical cord that are concerned with the extension of the arms and the actions of more of our proximal upper extremity muscles. So here's where this is important. Imagine that you happen to trip and you're falling forward. What would make great sense would be that you protect yourself against the impact by extending your arms and that you get your face out of the way. So there is a reflex that is triggered by the forward acceleration of the head. So activation of the superior canals will lead to the dorsal flexion of the neck and the extension of the arms. This is a vestibulocervical reflex connecting the vestibular system to the cervical spinal cord, and it's bilateral. Okay, so that makes good sense. We want bilateral extension of the arms, and we want to be able to pull the head back symmetrically on both sides of the neck. Now, the lateral vestibulospinal tract is a bit different. The lateral vestibulospinal tract originates in the lateral vestibular nucleus and the spinal vestibular nucleus, and it gives rise to descending projections that run, again, through more or less the anterior medial white matter of the spinal cord, but they do so on the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord, and they innervate motor neurons that are primarily now in the lumbosacral enlargement, because what this tract is mostly concerned with is maintaining the extensor tone of the anti-gravity muscles of the lower extremity. So here's this system in action. Imagine that you're riding on a moving bus or a train and it's crowded and you can't find a seat. So you're standing up on that train or that bus while the floor is moving underneath your feet. And so there are lots of jolts and bumps along the way, lots of unexpected rotational accelerations of your head as you're being jostled around with the movement of the train or the vehicle. And in order to maintain that upright posture, we need to increase the tone of our extensor muscles in the legs. And we do so in an ipsilateral fashion. That is, if I begin to fall to my right, I'm going to activate my right-sided vestibular labyrinth, and that needs to send signals down the right side of my spinal cord and activate the motor neurons that will extend the muscles of my right leg so I can support myself and not fall over to the right. If I were to fall forward while standing up on that train, then activation of the superior canals ought to allow me to brake myself against possibly falling forward by extending my anti-gravity muscles in the forward direction, and so on for each kind of movement. So it makes sense that this needs to be an ipsilateral pathway so that we can support ourselves against motion to one side or the other. So again, it's important to recognize that the medial vestibulospinal tract is mainly a connection to the cervical spinal cord, while the lateral vestibulospinal tract really runs the length of the cord, but it's especially concerned with the activation of extensor muscles in the lower extremities. And lastly, I'd like to just talk very briefly about higher vestibular processing. So obviously our vestibular system gives us a sense of motion, a sense of position of our head relative to the environment, and that environment is defined in large measure by our visual and our auditory signals that are integrated with other dimensions of mechanosensation that are derived from our somatic sensory system. And all of these signals come together in the parietal cortex. So how do vestibular signals get to the parietal cortex? Well, there are projections from some of the nuclei of the vestibular nuclear complex that project into the thalamus, somewhere into this ventral posterior complex of the thalamus, very near where our dorsal column, medial lemniscal, and anterolateral system afferents terminate. And then cells in this ventral posterior complex of the thalamus give rise to projections into the parietal lobe. There seem to be some projections that end near the face representation in the somatic sensory cortex, and these projections seem to be targeting Brodmann's area 3A, which is where we have representation of our proprioceptive signals. And there is a more posterior target in Brodmann's area 5 that seems to receive this input from the thalamus concerning vestibular signals. Now, this information is integrated in the parietal lobe together with this visual and auditory and somatic sensory information that helps to define our image of our body relative to the environment and our motions through that environment. And finally, there are some additional vestibular connections I'd like to mention. The vestibular nuclei also receive input from other sensory modalities, including somatic sensation, audition, probably very indirectly through visual pathways that run through the midbrain and the pretectum. And these stimuli are together integrated with our vestibular senses and help orient our head relative to the stimuli we encounter and the motions that we generate. As I mentioned briefly, the vestibular nuclei are intimately connected with a portion of the cerebellum that we call the floccular nodular lobe, or the vestibulocerebellum. And the vestibular nuclei have something of a privileged relationship with the cortex of the cerebellum in this one division. And there's a sense, as we'll discover, that the vestibular nuclei can be considered a set of deep cerebellar nuclei that are found in the brainstem, rather than on the roof of the fourth ventricle. So we'll come back and see that when we study the cerebellum. Now, finally, The vestibular nuclei are connected to parts of the reticular formation that are found in the core of the brainstem that are integrating visceral sensory signals and giving rise to visceral motor commands as well. So you may wonder, well, why should you feel ill when you have these unusual vestibular sensations that are consistent with motion, even when there's no motion happening? Or maybe you're wondering, well, what about seasickness? When there's this vestibular modulation that's going on that ultimately might lead you to feel quite ill, and you might actually engage in visceral motor activity, such as vomiting. Well, there are vestibular connections to the reticular formation that will engage these coordinations of visceral motor activities that might actually produce that motor action. And then there are ascending connections from the reticular formation that will influence our feelings of wellness. And it's through those integrated signals, together with the more direct impact via the connections from the thalamus to the parietal cortex, that result in these feelings of illness and dizziness and ill-being. And if any of you have ever been motion sick or seasick, or if you've ever had a condition called benign paroxysmal positional vertigo, you know the power of the vestibular system to generate feelings of illness, even in the absence of motion. Well, I hope this has been helpful to you. We won't attempt to identify the precise location of the pathways for vestibular processing, but I do want you to know where the vestibular nuclei are. So if you haven't yet done so, why don't you jump into either the atlas pages at the back of the textbook or into Sylvius and find these vestibular nuclei. So I'll do that for you in just a moment. So perhaps you might want to grab the textbook or open Sylvius and you can follow along.